My mother said, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that always felt like a prelude to something sharp, your brother's party is going to be absolutely epic. We've booked the caterer, the DJ, even a bouncy castle for the adults. It's the culmination of his entire high school career. I had been carefully arranging the small, potted succulents on my windowsill, the ritualistic act of familiar balm against the low hum of anxiety that was my constant companion in this house. The air in my small room, the one at the back of the house that always smelled faintly of damp plaster, seemed to thicken with her pronouncement. Epic. Culmination. The words hung in the air, not for me, but for him. For Daniel. My twin brother. And I, the silent satellite orbiting his sun, was meant to just absorb it. Accept the echo. This was our norm. A carefully curated existence where Daniel's achievements, no matter how minor, were monumental events, and my own were footnotes, often unwritten. My graduation ceremony was next week. A significant milestone, I'd thought. A moment I'd worked towards for 4 years, juggling a part-time job at the local library to help with expenses, late nights fueled by lukewarm coffee and sheer stubbornness. I'd mentioned it, of course. A casual, my graduation is the 15th, thrown into the ether during dinner. The response? A vague nod from Dad, a distracted hum from Mom as she scrolled through her phone, probably planning Daniel's next elaborate conquest. The house itself was a character in this unspoken drama. It was large, sprawling, and always felt a little too loud, a little too bright when Daniel was around. His laughter bounced off the walls, his demands were met with immediate, unquestioning alacrity. My presence was more of a muted background static. I was the one who remembered to pick up Dad's dry cleaning, the one who quietly paid the utility bills when they arrived in the mail, the one who ensured there was always milk in the fridge, even though I rarely saw a full carton myself. My accomplishments were quiet victories, celebrated in the solitude of my own mind, or shared with a select few friends who understood the subtle currents of my family's emotional economy. Daniel, on the other hand, was a supernova. His report cards were framed. His debate club victories were discussed at length over family dinners. His prom photos occupied prime real estate on the mantelpiece. He was the golden child, the heir apparent, the one whose every whim was meticulously catered to. And my parents, enamored by his brilliance, seemed to have forgotten I existed outside of a supporting role. There was the time in junior year, when I'd landed the lead in the school play, a role I'd auditioned for months prior, practicing lines in the shower, my voice barely a whisper so as not to disturb the delicate ecosystem of the household. The night of my final performance, the one that had garnered glowing reviews from the local paper, my parents had been conspicuously absent. A text message arrived an hour before curtain call. So sorry, darling. Daniel has his championship soccer game tonight. We'll watch your recording later, promise. The recording, of course, never materialized. They were too busy celebrating Daniel's overtime goal. Then there was the summer after sophomore year. I'd saved up for months, working extra shifts at the library, to afford a week-long art workshop in the city. It was a dream, a chance to learn from actual professionals, to immerse myself in something I loved. 2 days before I was due to leave, my parents called me into the living room. Daniel had decided he wanted a new gaming console, a top-of-the-line model that cost a small fortune. My art workshop money, they explained, with an air of benevolent sacrifice, would be a gift to Daniel to help him get the console. You understand, darling, Mom had said, patting my hand, her nails long and painted a garish shade of fuchsia. Daniel's happiness is paramount right now. This workshop, it's not exactly a necessity, is it? My carefully hoarded savings, gone. The disappointment had a physical weight, pressing down on my chest for weeks. These were not isolated incidents. They were the consistent thrum of my existence. The background radiation of parental favoritism. I learned to swallow my hurt, to retreat into myself, to find solace in my own pursuits, the ones that didn't require their validation or their approval. I cultivated a quiet resilience, a silent observer in my own life, cataloging their omissions, their dismissals, the casual cruelty of their selective attention. And then came the announcement. The one that felt like a physical blow. My graduation. The day I'd envisioned with a quiet sense of pride, a milestone I'd earned. It was scheduled for Friday, June 14th. A date etched into my mind. The previous weekend, Daniel had announced, with a flourish that demanded attention, that his friends were throwing him a surprise party for his graduation too. A pool party, at our neighbor, Mr. Henderson's sprawling estate. Mr. Henderson, a wealthy businessman, was a close friend of my father's, and his property was legendary for its opulence. My parents, beaming, immediately offered to host it at their place instead. Of course, darling. Mom had declared, her voice ringing with misplaced enthusiasm. We can make it even better. A proper send-off for our star graduate. The initial plan was for Daniel's party to be on Saturday, the 15th. The day my graduation. A comfortable distance, I'd thought. A way to acknowledge both without overlap. It seemed, for once, that I might exist on the same calendar as Daniel. Then, on Monday morning, the day before graduation week officially began, I found myself at the kitchen table, nursing a mug of tea that had long gone cold. Dad was reading the newspaper, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. Mom was on the phone, her voice hushed but animated. Daniel was sprawled on the sofa in the living room, his gaming headset on, a symphony of electronic explosions emanating from his headphones. Mom hung up, a triumphant smile gracing her lips. Well, that's settled, she announced, her gaze sweeping over us. Mr. Henderson just called. He's going to be out of town for the weekend, so we can have Daniel's party at his place after all. It's perfect. The pool, the space, it'll be so much more spectacular. My hand tightened around my mug. Wait, I said, my voice betraying a tremor I couldn't quite control. When exactly is Daniel's party now? Mom beamed, oblivious to the sudden chill in my voice. Saturday, of course. But Mr. Henderson said we could use his place from Friday evening onwards. So, we're moving it up. Daniel's big send-off will be on Friday night, starting at 7. It's much better, don't you think? More exciting. The air in the kitchen went still. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway seemed deafening. Friday night. My graduation was on Friday afternoon. The ceremony was at 3 p.m. It would likely run until 5 p.m., and then there was the short drive home, the brief respite to change, maybe grab a quick bite before. But, I started, my voice barely a whisper. My graduation is on Friday. Dad lowered his newspaper, his brow furrowed slightly, as if I'd just spoken a foreign language. Yours? Oh, right. That's unfortunate. Mom's smile faltered for a millisecond, then snapped back into place, brighter than before. Yes, darling, it is a bit of a clash, isn't it? But Daniel's party is such a special occasion. It's his celebration. We've already told everyone about Friday night. It would be so disruptive to change it now. She gestured vaguely with her hand. Don't worry, though. We'll be there for the important bits of your graduation. We'll probably have to leave a little early, but we'll cheer you on. Cheer me on. Leave early. For Daniel's pool party. My stomach churned. The image of my parents, dressed in their finest, mingling with Mr. Henderson's guests, toasting Daniel while I stood on a stage accepting a piece of paper, hit me with the force of a physical blow. But you, I said, the words escaping before I could censor them. The accusation hung heavy in the air. The carefully constructed facade of my compliance had finally cracked. Mom's eyes narrowed. The saccharine sweetness evaporated, replaced by a cool, dismissive annoyance. Promised what, exactly? We said we'd attend your graduation. We will. This is just a slight scheduling conflict. Daniel's party is a much bigger event for the family, a celebration him. Your graduation is, well, its thing. The implication was clear, brutal in its simplicity. My achievement was personal, solitary. Daniel's was a family affair, a communal spectacle. My 4 years of hard work, my sacrifices, my quiet triumphs, were less important than a splashy party for my brother. Dad cleared his throat. Your mother's right, son. Daniel's party is a significant social event. We have commitments. It's just bad timing. He turned back to his newspaper, effectively closing the conversation. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. The teacup rattled in its saucer. The silence that followed was more deafening than any argument. It was the silence of finality. The silence of their choice. I walked out of the kitchen, the distant thrum of Daniel's game the only sound. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. A cold, quiet rage began to simmer within me, a stark contrast to the burning shame I felt. They had made their decision. And in that moment, so had I. The next few days were a blur of forced normalcy. I attended my final classes, packed my belongings, and went through the motions of preparing for graduation. I saw my parents around the house, busy with their preparations for Daniel's party. They'd bought new decorations, a ridiculously expensive sound system for the pool area, and hired a caterer. Our Daniel, of course, was ecstatic, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing within his twin. The day of my graduation arrived, bright and sunny, a cruel mockery of the gray emptiness inside me. I put on my cap and gown in my room, the fabric feeling heavy, almost suffocating. I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked, alone. Mom and Dad were already dressed, ready to head to Mr. Henderson's. They were practically vibrating with excitement. Have fun, darling. Mom chirped, offering a quick, perfunctory peck on my cheek. We'll be thinking of you. Don't forget, 7 o'clock sharp for Daniel's party. Dad offered a gruff nod. Make us proud. And then they were gone, their car pulling out of the driveway with a rev of the engine, leaving me in the echoing silence of the house. I drove myself to the university. I walked across the stage, accepted my diploma, and smiled for the photographers. My friends were there, their cheers genuine, their embraces warm. They understood. They'd seen the subtle slights, the quiet neglect. But even with their support, the hollowness persisted. I tried to feel proud, to feel accomplished. But all I felt was the gnawing emptiness of their absence. I drove home, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon. The house was still, the sounds of distant revelry from Mr. Henderson's place a faint, mocking echo. I walked into the kitchen. On the counter, next to a half-eaten plate of hors d'oeuvres, sat a single, unopened envelope addressed to me. It was a formal invitation to Daniel's graduation party. Addressed to our beloved son. That was it. The final, definitive stroke. Not a word. Not an acknowledgement. Just, an invitation to my brother's celebration, an event that had directly usurped my own. I picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, embossed. A small, mocking smile touched my lips. I didn't go to Daniel's party. I didn't rage. I didn't confront them. Instead, I went back to my room. I pulled out a folder I'd meticulously organized over the past year. Inside were documents. Deeds. Bank statements. Legal correspondences. My grandparents, my mother's parents, had passed away 2 years prior. They had left a substantial inheritance, primarily in the form of a prime piece of real estate in the city and a significant sum of money. The will, meticulously drafted and uncontested, stated that the inheritance was to be split equally between my mother and her sister. However, my mother's sister had passed away shortly after the will was finalized, leaving her share to her 2 children, my cousins. This meant my mother was entitled to half the inheritance. My father, acting as executor of the will, a role he'd taken on with much fanfare, had handled the legalities. He'd been meticulous. Almost too meticulous. I opened one of the documents. It was a power of attorney, granting my father the authority to manage the inherited assets on my mother's behalf, as she had been overwhelmed by grief at the time of her parents' passing. He had, of course, presented it to her as a mere formality, a way to streamline the process. She, desperate to avoid further emotional strain, had signed it without question. And then, about 6 months ago, my grandmother's property had been sold. A tidy sum, in cash. The proceeds of sale were deposited directly into a joint account held by my parents. Ostensibly, to be divided according to the will. But here's where the quiet execution began. I retrieved another document. It was a carefully worded letter, drafted by a solicitor I had discreetly consulted a few months prior. It was addressed to my mother. It detailed the discrepancy. The fact that the proceeds of sale, while deposited into a joint account, were technically intended for my mother's half of the inheritance, and the other half was meant for my cousins. It also highlighted a clause in the original inheritance agreement, a clause my father had subtly inserted during the probate process, that stipulated any significant financial transactions involving the inherited assets would require the explicit consent of beneficiaries. My cousins, of course, had never given their consent for the sale. And then there was the bank statement. A detailed record of withdrawals from the joint account over the past year. Significant sums, withdrawn regularly, for household expenses, investments, and personal use. But what struck me was the timing of certain large withdrawals, coinciding precisely with Daniel's various expensive hobbies, his new car, his expensive trips, his designer clothes. I also had a copy of the original will. And a subsequent codicil. A codicil my mother had signed, again under duress of grief and my father's insistent guidance, which had gifted a significant portion of her anticipated inheritance to her beloved son, Daniel, to ensure his future success. This codicil, however, was legally shaky. It had been drafted without independent legal counsel for my mother and was contested by my cousins. I meticulously compiled a folder. The power of attorney. The sale deed. The bank statements. The contested codicil. The solicitor's letter outlining the legal implications. The correspondence from my cousin's lawyer, politely but firmly demanding an accounting of the funds. I walked out of my room, the folder held securely in my hand. I found my parents in the living room, still buzzing from Daniel's party. Daniel was sprawled on the sofa, recounting stories of his triumphs, his face flushed with success. My parents were listening, beaming, their faces alight with pride. I stood in the doorway. They turned, their smiles fading slightly as they saw the folder. "What's that?" my mother asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. I didn't answer. I walked over to the coffee table, the polished wood gleaming under the lamps. I placed the folder down, its weight a solid presence in the room. "I believe," I said, my voice unnervingly calm, "this requires your attention." My father reached for the folder, his hand trembling slightly. He opened it, his eyes scanning the first document. His face, usually so assured, began to drain of color. My mother peered over his shoulder, her expression shifting from curiosity to confusion, then to dawning horror. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice reedy. "What have you done?" "I've simply gathered some information," I replied, my gaze steady. "Information that appears to indicate a significant misallocation of assets from your inheritance. And some rather questionable decisions regarding the estate of my grandparents." My father looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of panic and anger. "This is preposterous. I handled everything legally." "Did you?" I asked, my voice remaining level. "Because it seems the legal definition of handling everything might be slightly different from your interpretation. Especially when it involves bypassing consent from other beneficiaries and creating a codicil that is, at best, highly contestable, all while funneling funds towards Daniel's exorbitant lifestyle." Daniel, who had been listening with a growing sense of unease, sat up straighter. "What are you talking about? What's going on?" My father, his face a mask of fury, slammed the folder shut. "This is none of your business. Get out." "Actually," I said, my gaze locking onto my mother's pale face, "it is my business. Because it seems my mother has been rather misled. And my cousins are demanding answers. Answers that, it seems, only you two can provide." The silence that followed was absolute. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, with the weight of their deception finally made manifest. Daniel stared at me, then at his parents, his face a picture of bewildered betrayal. My mother sank back onto the sofa, her hands clasped tightly together. Her eyes were fixed on the folder, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. You didn't," she stammered, looking at my father with dawning realization. He avoided her gaze, his jaw tight. "I just want what's fair," I said, my voice soft but firm. "And I believe my cousins are owed an explanation. And perhaps, a significant sum of money. Money that, it seems, has been reallocated." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. My cousins, armed with the evidence I had provided, launched a full-scale legal investigation. The power of attorney was challenged. The contested codicil was thrown out. The court ordered a thorough audit of all inherited assets. My parents, initially defiant, quickly crumbled under the legal pressure. My father, exposed and embarrassed, was forced to admit to numerous financial improprieties. The land sale was deemed invalid without my cousin's consent. The money my mother had gifted to Daniel was frozen. The court ordered that the remaining inherited assets be liquidated and distributed according to the original will, with significant penalties and legal fees levied against my parents. Daniel was devastated. His lavish lifestyle, funded by what he believed was his parents' generosity, came to an abrupt halt. His epic graduation party was now a footnote in a sprawling legal saga. He was forced to withdraw from university, unable to afford the tuition. His friends, many of whom owed him favors and had benefited from his family's perceived wealth, began to distance themselves. He was now facing the harsh reality of a life without his usual safety net, a life he had never been prepared for. My mother, stripped of her perceived wealth and her husband's manipulative support, was a broken woman. The social consequences were immediate and brutal. Their friends, who had always courted them for their status, vanished. The whispers turned into open condemnation. She was seen as a victim, yes, but also as complicit. A fool. I watched it all unfold from a distance. I didn't gloat. I didn't revel in their downfall. There was a cold satisfaction, a sense of grim justice served. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. About consequence. I moved out of the family home shortly after the legal proceedings began, renting a small apartment in the city. I continued my studies, focused on my own future, a future I was now building on my own terms, free from the shadow of their expectations and their manipulations. The silence that followed their public humiliation was profound. No frantic calls. No desperate pleas. Just, the quiet hum of a life rebuilt, on solid ground, free from the toxic foundations of deceit. The closure wasn't loud or dramatic. It was cold, clean, and undeniably final. They had chosen Daniel's pool party. And in doing so, they had drowned their own legacy in the shallow end.